I'm your host, Lorna Liana, and I'm really excited to bring to you Ben Malcolm, known as the Spirit Pharmacist, a board certified psychiatric pharmacist who provides online education and consultation services that focus on how traditional medications treat mental illnesses, interact and interface with psychedelics. We are going to talk about drug interactions with ayahuasca, the good, the bad, and the spiritual. Welcome to the series, Ben.
Thanks so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, Lorna.
So I'm so curious about what happened for you that inspired you to embark upon this very unique career of becoming a spirit pharmacist. Did you receive an ayahuasca vision of your vocation?
Yes and no. I would say the real vision I had for Spirit Pharmacist actually happened not during an ayahuasca vision, but it was a conference about ayahuasca. It's called Visionary Convergence a number of years ago now. And I was just sitting there and thinking about how in the world of pharmacy, we're so used to drugs that have physiologic effects like lowering blood pressure or lowering blood sugar if you have high blood pressure or diabetes, drugs that have emotional effects like antidepressants, drugs that have cognitive effects like stimulants or Alzheimer's medications. But there's really nothing in the world of pharmacy or even the world of medicine that is discussing the spiritual nature or spiritual aspects of drugs. And it's pretty clear that psychedelics are able to elicit, really bona fide and powerful types of mystical or spiritual experiences. And so for me, the kind of convergence of spirituality and biology where these drugs meet was just so fascinating and important for people to learn about and understand. So I really started Spirit Pharmacist because I wanted to raise awareness that there is a spiritual dimension to drugs and particularly psychedelics.
But are all drugs spiritual, or are some drugs more spiritual than others? Is cocaine spiritual?
Well, I think that a lot of that is like in the subjective perception of the user, right? And when it comes to measuring spirituality or measuring spiritual experience, there are certain rating scales, and people do essentially report psychedelics as being a spiritual experience, where it's pretty rarely reported that cocaine is a spiritual experience. And of course, you could say like, well, isn't life spiritual? Like isn't our existence just spiritual in nature? So of course, any drug experience could be spiritual, right? Like any moment that we live our lives could be spiritual, but it seems that the people that are ingesting all of these substances report very strong spiritual experience pretty reliably with psychedelics, whereas other drugs, it's very few and far between that someone would say that was their true feelings in the moment.
Do you think that some drugs have a spirit ally associated with it? This has been a topic of great debate that I enjoy having with other people. Does modafinil have consciousness versus psilocybin kind of thing? What do you see or think from a pharmacological perspective?
Well, I think like pharmacology, right, is traditionally rooted in a pretty physicalist type of worldview, in that it's typically approached from the perspective is that you have a nervous system or neurons that are conducting themselves electrically and chemically, and this gives rise to our subjective experience of consciousness. I think that particularly in the realm of astrophysics, that is really being questioned as far as does the physical basis of things really give rise to consciousness, or maybe does consciousness give rise to the kind of physical nature of things. So I understand that there's like a bigger debate out there really about, like is our entire existence physical, or, our entire existence kind of created by consciousness. And I'm not an expert philosopher, and I don't have like all the answers to the keys of the universe. I think going back to like the first part of the question around like allies or like plant spirits, I would say that again, that really depends on the experience of the person. I've met some people that are, you know, extremely deep into the idea of animism or plants having spirits and plants having communion with them. I've met other people that are much more philosophically, psychedelics essentially reconnect us with ourselves. And, you know, there's different parts of the self, and, you know, maybe there's a part of ourself that is the highest self, or the enlightened self, essentially. And for whatever reason, psychedelics open up that space of true self within us. So whether it's, you know, a plant ally or a plant spirit that's communicating with you, giving you the type of information and insight you need to live a better life, or whether you feel that the substance is opening up a spiritual part of you that knows the best part, the way forward in your life, is a little bit irrelevant to me, actually. I think like mostly I'm interested in, is the person feeling more connected with themselves and feeling like they're moving forward in a helpful sort of way.
Okay, but what about in your own personal experience, right? If you're going to look back on the experiences that you might have had on, you know, the chemical psychedelics like LSD or MDMA, and compare that to ayahuasca or psilocybin or iboga. I don't know if you've done iboga. Seems pretty hardcore, that one. I'm working up for the day, perhaps. Do you notice, though, a difference? I mean, it seems like across the board. I mean, granted, this might all be anecdotal, and it would be very interesting to collect a database of user, you know, stories as to whether or not they have an experience of ayahuasca consciousness versus something else. But in your experience, do you get a sense that some of these psychedelics have more of a consciousness than others? An independent consciousness, like they're trying to tell you something. You might not want to listen, but it's for your own good.
Yeah, so all of the psychedelics do very qualitatively different types of things, or they can have qualitatively different types of experiences. And this is getting away from ayahuasca, but if you compare, for example, they've done surveys of NN-DMT experiences versus 5-MeO DMT experiences, and it seems that the 5-MeO experience is highly characterized by non-dual or like unifying type of states, whereas it seems like DMT experiences are really characterized by a retainment of a subjective identity and an experience of a different entity, like whether that entity is the spirit of ayahuasca or an alien or some type of archangel ally. With DMT or NN-DMT specifically, there really does seem to be a phenomenologic effect where the person perceives some type of other entity, and that is different than other types of psychedelics like 5-MeO DMT, which seems much more characterized by a kind of a non-dual state, or essentially existing as everything.
But even the 5-MeO that might come from the Bufo alvarius toad, did you ever get a sense of a toad consciousness?
Me personally, no.
I thank you for sharing. Yeah, I find all of this so fascinating. So,
Yeah.
So going,
at least not yet.
Yeah, I'm trying to tune in as to whether, I'm kind of making it up because I want to believe there's a toad spirit, or whether I actually remember there being one. And, I've only really had 2 experiences. And so I can't say that personally I felt that there was a toad entity kind of like, lurking around, or like I was one with the toad entity. I definitely felt the feeling of oneness with everything. And there was no other thing there. So so it was pretty massive. Going back to ayahuasca though, so I know that, granted, so there's different people have different experiences on the different psychedelics, and that might extend out to like different senses of a external consciousness. But then going to, the kinds of interactions that you might want to be aware of when you're using the different psychedelics, that's also an area to be much more aware of as well, because those kinds of interactions can, create some harm, and even long-lasting, difficulty or discomfort or risk for us. So is there any type of difference in, do you need to be aware of drug interactions for all psychedelics, kind of like they're all one thing, or do you have to pay attention to the different kind of psychedelic and what they might be interacting with on a much more risky basis?
Yeah, so there's definitely differences between the drug interaction profiles of different types of psychedelic substances. So I say more the latter, in that there really are some substances and combinations which are pretty risky, and some which, like, well, it's not that risky at all. Ayahuasca in general, because it's a combination of at least two plants, and one of them, the ayahuasca vine, contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors. The drug interaction potential of ayahuasca is actually quite starkly different than some other psychedelic medicines like psilocybin mushrooms or LSD, and it's specifically because of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors in the vine. Probably something like NN-DMT as a psychedelic might have a similar interaction profile to LSD or psilocybin, but it's really because ayahuasca has monoamine oxidase inhibitors and ayahuasca vine in it that it creates a different type of interaction profile where there really is risk of physical harm. I think of other psychedelics, particularly psilocybin, as being very safe physically, and the risks more associated with intense psychology and setting and essentially the environment of ingestion. Whereas ayahuasca, because of the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, there really is a risk with other drugs as far as creating situations where there can be physical harm.
Okay, so going to the psilocybin first. So let me clarify. Is what you're saying that psilocybin is relatively low risk? Like you could pretty much combine it with anything, and get away with it without any severe reactions?
Yeah, so psilocybin and LSD are two tryptamine psychedelic substances where we know that the lethal limit is more than 100-fold overdose, maybe even more than 1,000-fold, right? And there's very few psychoactive substances that have that type of safety profile in overdose. So when you're thinking about drug interactions with psilocybin, there is literally no combination that I've found that has been, demonstrated to, be extremely physically risky or physically harmful. However, I would just caution or say that anytime you're mixing psychoactive substances, there is potential for, things to happen that wouldn't happen if you just took that single drug alone. I guess what I'm saying is, like, if you really look at like really serious like poison control cases from drugs, and I'm not talking just psychedelics, I'm just talking drugs in general, combinations always stand out as something that increases risk.
Got it. So when you're saying like 1,000-fold, do you mean if somebody took, let's say, 1,000 times the a full adult dose of LSD or psilocybin, then maybe they might die of overdose? Or will they?
Correct.
That's
correct. So will they die or will they not? Like, is kind of unclear. Will there be, some pretty severe physical stuff going on that might require hospitalization for a day or two? Sure. And I think it's specifically like LSD, right? Because it's so potent, like a normal dose of LSD is 100 to 150 micrograms, right? So there's 1,000 micrograms to 1 milligram, right? So we're talking about something insanely potent. So if you take, 10 milligrams of LSD, that's 100-fold overdose. Or no, wait, maybe 1,000-fold overdose right there.
Yeah,
so
I don't know
it
how you would come out of that normal in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so it's 100-fold overdose, right? And so there have been cases, of people accidentally ingesting, that much crystalline LSD, and, they may need to go to the hospital for a few days, but they didn't die, which is
What happened to them after?
pretty wild. Oh, well, there's possibility of like something like a seizure like occurring, right? Like there's a possibility of, some symptoms of serotonin toxicity, but that's just it, is that with ayahuasca and the monoamine oxidase inhibitors, the wrong drug combinations can give you a serotonin toxicity that is bona fide, sincerely life-threatening. Whereas it seems like the psilocybin and LSD, with big overdoses or in combinations, you may get a mild or moderate type of serotonin toxicity, but it rarely pushes to the point where it's actually life-threatening. Basically, there's a ceiling effect on how much serotonin toxicity you can get from something like psilocybin or LSD.
I'm genuinely curious, are there any known cases of people that died from serotonin syndrome because they were on antidepressants and went into an ayahuasca ceremony, or is it more of a theoretical thing?
Yeah, so it's pretty unclear. There's definitely a few cases out there in the literature that report like really severe or intense type of physical effects for people that were taking antidepressants and used ayahuasca. There's a few case reports of deaths with 5-MeO-DMT with ayahuasca. There's also an article from the US that tracked poison control calls, or calls to poison control centers related to ayahuasca. And there were some, ICU admissions, people that, their respiration stopped and had to get a breathing tube put in, seizures, and, a handful of deaths there. I think the caveat, though, is that when looking at those poison control cases, the average person, right? So like 80-something% of people are males between the ages of like 17 and 23, which to me sort of suggests that there probably is some real risk of drug interaction, but it's usually not the ceremony goer that's maybe in their 30s, 40s, and 50s that's kind of thinking about drug interactions and maybe going through a screening process with a facilitator. It's probably essentially some impulsive male teenagers ordering the ingredients off the internet and just kind of doing their own thing as far as an experiment. So it's a little bit of a black box as far as like, well, what did they do with ayahuasca that led them to have this severe of an adverse effect or adverse reaction? But I think it kind of does point to a drug interaction potential, because you would also expect, well, geez, like a 20-year-old male that's not on interacting substances, drugs, or medications probably has some of the most robust physical health among people in general. So the fact that they're the people that end up getting hurt, I think really does speak to there is risk and there is this like drug interaction potential of severe adverse things, but it's usually probably not associated with a ceremony goer that goes through like a screening process and really plans out their experience ahead of time.
So is it a common risk or outcome? Is it a common occurrence for somebody to have an adverse effect with MAOIs and ayahuasca? Like, is it happening enough in the ceremony community for there to be serious, concern, or is it more like, okay, it's recommended because we want to be super safe? I'm just trying to figure out like, what the percentage.
This is really good in far as like I don't know the answer as far as a percentage risk. In my practice, in my consulting practice, I've definitely had a few people that have like come to me and said like, hey, I was on this antidepressant like Cymbalta or duloxetine, and I was going to go to the ceremony and they told me to stop it. I just stopped it cold turkey 4 days ahead of time, and then in the ceremony, I had like jaw clenching that was so severe, like I cracked a tooth. And it's kind of like, okay, well, geez, is that going to the hospital? No, but that sounds like something happened to you that was different than what other people happened to you, right? And I think like the thing to keep in mind here is like serotonin toxicity is essentially a type of serotonin poisoning. So it depends on how much serotonin you have. or how much the increase or elevation is as far as like how severe the poisoning is going to be. And everything works on a probability kind of basis when we're talking about adverse reactions of drugs and medications. So it could be that the risk is somewhat low, but the consequence is very severe, right? So it could be something that's rare but severe. So for example, let's just say the chances of getting a severe serotonin toxicity with antidepressants in ayahuasca is 3%. Well, that means that 97 out of 100 people are going to be saying, oh, that's not an issue, I did that. But the 3 people that had to go to the hospital, or the 3 people that had severe harms, are probably not the ones that are hanging out on the ayahuasca forum on the internet and telling everyone about how wonderful it is and how there's no problem there, right? So I'm kind of, that's why we really in pharmacology like bigger kind of data sets, and not really relying on, well, someone said anecdotally that this combination was safe, because we're essentially thinking on a much larger and a much more statistical type of level. And if you were an ayahuasca facilitator, right, let's just say you hold ceremonies every weekend, you have 20 people in each ceremony, that means that you're probably having about 1,000 people per year drink, right? So if you let 1,000 people with that 3% risk in it, that'd be 30 that had like a bad outcome, right? So when it comes to thinking about risks with drugs and ayahuasca, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's not that common, but what you're talking about is something that is potentially life-threatening. So you would still want to do a lot of kind of conservative thinking about, how do I pretty much make this universally safe, even if the percentage rate of the reaction happening is not that high overall.
Yeah, I would agree with that, in the sense that you wouldn't want to be that 3% person. And it would probably just be a terrible experience as well. So, I think that's the risk factor that would then is a cause for concern, and to err on the side of caution. So can you explain a little bit about the difference between reversible and non-reversible MAOIs?
Yes, certainly. So there's a few different types of monoamine oxidase inhibitors out there, and there's a few different types of monoamine oxidase actually. So there's kind of monoamine oxidase A and B, and then there's reversible and irreversible inhibitors. So kind of think of a quadrant, right? You've got A and B on top, and then on the other side, you've got reversible or irreversible. So let's just start with the monoamine oxidase inhibitors in ayahuasca. So they are pretty potent inhibitors of monoamine oxidase, and they're fairly selective for monoamine oxidase A. And monoamine oxidase A is the type that breaks down serotonin. So what this is telling me, potent inhibitor, monoamine oxidase A, pharmacologically is telling me there probably is some real serious drug interaction potential for serotonin syndrome, right? Now, thinking of reversibility and irreversibility, this has to do with the length of time that you're really vulnerable for experiencing that type of toxicity. So when we're talking about ayahuasca, we're talking about reversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A. So inhibits monoamine oxidase A, real serotonin drug interaction potential. Reversible, the length of time or period that you're metabolically vulnerable is shorter than if it was an irreversible inhibitor. So the first antidepressants that came to market, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors that were the first antidepressants, are non-specific. So they inhibit both monoamine oxidase A and B, and they're irreversible, meaning that when they block or bind monoamine oxidase, they actually bind to the enzyme in a way that the drug cannot dissociate from the enzyme anymore. It cannot dissociate from monoamine oxidase. And so to recover your metabolic capacity, your body has to actually make new monoamine oxidase. And this is something that takes a couple of weeks. Right? So the time of metabolic vulnerability and the severity of metabolic vulnerability, particularly with food, because that's more related to A and B, those I guess what I'm saying is that those initial antidepressants, the irreversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A and B, probably have the highest risk of serotonin toxicities, and they probably have the highest risk of dietary interactions or cheese type of reactions with tyramine containing foods, which we haven't really even gotten there yet. Whereas ayahuasca, reversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A, yeah, there's probably some real risk of serotonin toxicity, but the window of vulnerability may be quite a bit shorter. And this could be one factor why you see less serotonin toxicity with ayahuasca versus those kind of original ones.
Are these old school antidepressants still on the market? Are people still being prescribed these, that generation of antidepressants?
They're still on the market and you do see them prescribed, but it's very rare. And it's usually the kind of person that's failed several of the newer types of SSRIs or SNRI medications. Maybe they've even tried some things that are more for like refractory depression, like lithium or thyroid hormones or ketamine. And when those things haven't worked, if they're, I don't know, high functioning enough to understand the drug interaction and food interaction risks, then it can get prescribed. But because of the level of awareness that the person has to have about their dietary intake and the drugs that it could potentially interact with, it's fairly rare overall. And they would even encourage people, like if you're going to be on a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, to like wear a wristband that says you're on one in case something happens to you. And you have to get emergency care, so the people caring for you even understand that you're taking it without you saying it, so they know what to give or what not to give you. So basically, it's complicated to have somebody on them. They work really well, like honestly, for like really low melancholic, really sad Eeyore type of depression. Those original monoamine oxidase inhibitors are probably the most effective pharmaceutical antidepressants that have come to market. But because of the severity of drug and dietary interaction risks, they're sort of relegated to last line agents at this point.
Interesting. So what other drugs are considered to be contraindicated with ayahuasca?
Yeah, so probably the two main things, right? Because to get serotonin toxicity, you have to have more serotonin in your synapse, which is just the space between neurons. So you have to have more serotonin there. And so monoamine oxidase inhibition by ayahuasca vine blocks the metabolism of serotonin. So you lose the ability to get rid of it, right? The other two ways that you get more serotonin in the synapse is blocking serotonin reuptake. So these are all of those traditional types of antidepressants, the SSRIs, the SNRIs, they all block serotonin reuptake, or drugs that release serotonin. And probably the flagship drug that releases serotonin is actually another psychedelic, it's the phenethylamine MDMA. So kind of thinking about like how could I predict what would be dangerous as far as the risk of serotonin toxicity with ayahuasca the question would be, well, does this other drug have the ability to increase serotonin or maybe other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine or dopamine? So those are essentially the kind of primary mechanisms. And you'll hear a lot of like, well, what about this chlorpheniramine, this like over-the-counter antihistamine, like isn't like how could this be dangerous? And it's like because it blocks serotonin reuptake as well. I think methadone is another one. It's sort of like, well, how could this be dangerous? It's like, well, because it blocks serotonin reuptake as well. Drugs that release neurotransmitters like MDMA releases a lot of serotonin, so it's probably pretty high risk. But also drugs like amphetamine and cocaine, like the really, really strong stimulants, block some serotonin, but they also do a lot of dopamine and norepinephrine release. So it's essentially a problem of excess neurotransmitters, serotonin toxicity. And to kind of think about like, well, how could I predict which drugs have risk? It's kind of, well, do they block neurotransmitter reuptake or do they release neurotransmitters? And if you can solidly answer no to both of those, then the risk of getting a serotonin toxicity plummets extremely precipitously.
That's really intriguing and fascinating. It's interesting because know people who are offering ayahuasca ceremony with MDMA. And
Yeah.
on one hand, I'm just kind of like, wow, that seems a bit far out there. And knowing, I mean, it's the person's not a pharmacist or a doctor or anything, so I kind of found it to be a bit of a risky combination to start introducing people to. But you know, do we know of any casualties from that combination?
So specifically with ayahuasca and MDMA, I have not found any reports of that. There is one other pharmaceutical monoamine oxidase inhibitor out there called miclobamide, and this is kind of the pharmaceutical version of ayahuasca in that it's specific for monoamine oxidase A and it's reversible. So it's a reversible inhibitor of monoamine oxidase A, which is very parallel to the pharmacologic activity of ayahuasca, and there are several cases of either death or hospitalization with severe adverse effects from combining miclobamide with MDMA. Again, it's a type of poisoning, right? And so, like with Paracelsus, the father of pharmacology, I'm going to kind of butcher and paraphrase a little bit, but essentially he said, the only difference between medicine and poison is dose, right? And so thinking about, again, like serotonin toxicity and these reports of, well, they did this, it's kind of like, well, I don't know what kind of ayahuasca brew that they were using. Maybe they were using a brew that really has a whole lot less vine in it than others, or, maybe they're, mixing very, very small amounts of drugs that release serotonin, like rather than, doing just big standard amounts of both and mixing them together. I wouldn't recommend it because I kind of think you're playing with fire, and there's enough out there for me to be pretty worried about those types of combinations.
What's going on with ayahuasca and Bufo? That seemed to be a thing for a while until, ICEERS issued their scientific report about this. And, I found it interesting too, because there were some indigenous shamans that were traveling around and doing their ceremony circuit in the United States, I believe. And at one point, somebody handed the shaman a pipe and told him to inhale, and basically, fired up some Bufo for the shaman leading the ceremony. And, they were really they were kind of like not expecting that, and it's just kind of, it seems a bit like the Wild West out there, with people, not really thinking about possible drug interactions. So I know that there's a recommendation as to not mixing the two. Is there, what do you know about that? Is there a particular order that's safer? Because, some of these multi-drug retreats, even if they're not offering it the same night, they might be offering it consecutive nights, and or especially like offering powerful psychedelics one a day for like 5 days, which seems a bit far out.
So again, kind of thinking about the drug interaction potential of ayahuasca, it's like before you drink ayahuasca, you haven't drank the ayahuasca yet, right? So you do not have monoamine oxidase inhibited at that point. So before ayahuasca, it's all about the other drug that you're talking about. So if you're talking about Bufo or 5-MeO-DMT, the drug is eliminated from the body typically very quickly, right? To the point where you really could, have a big 5-MeO or DMT or Bufo experience, 1 to 2 hours before ingesting ayahuasca. And at least from a physical harm type of perspective, that would be relatively safe. Mentally, that sounds like a whole lot of opening and activation of energy, and some people may do very well with that, and some people that might just be like just way too much, right? Once you've ingested ayahuasca, though, now you're talking about, well, how long do those monoamine oxidase inhibitors in ayahuasca last? And they're pretty short acting, to be honest. Like they don't, probably the majority of them have been eliminated after around 12 hours, but one of them, the one that occurs in the lowest frequency in ayahuasca, actually THH or tetrahydroharmine, does have a longer period of time to elimination. And it's that one that ICEERS is basing their recommendation of waiting at least 24 hours after ingesting ayahuasca to use Bufo or 5-MeO-DMT. And I check their math and I like it. So I think that 24 hours afterwards is a really, I mean, you know, again, you'll meet people that say, well, I did it 7 hours afterwards and it was the most life-changing thing ever. You know, personally, I kind of feel like if you're approaching plant medicines from the perspective of psychospiritual exploration, or, you know, you want like some type of like healing, I think just ayahuasca in of itself offers plenty for you there. You know, if you're someone that's extremely experienced and you have a way more psychonautic type of intention or exploration, then I don't know, there's nothing wrong with psychonautics, but it's really for people with different types of intentions that have different levels of experience. And quite frankly, hopefully a lot of humility, because, you know, that's what they say, right? There's people that are old and people that are bold, but not many people that are old and bold, right? So I think we gotta, right, kind of think about who you are and what you're trying to get out of it when you're kind of thinking about like centers that may offer, you know, huge psychedelic experiences day after day. Or the other thing I kind of think about sometimes is purgative sacraments. It's like, so kind of thinking of, there's been a few cases where people have gotten real trouble or even died, for example, and it's sort of like, well, what did they do in the last 24 hours? They did combo and ayahuasca. And it's kind of like, well, is the combination, is it a drug interaction thing? You know, to the extent of my knowledge, like I can't figure out that it is. And I think it's much more like, well, geez, with combo, you usually drink half a gallon of water and then, you know, vomit a bunch. So there's probably some electrolyte loss there and probably some dilution of electrolytes in your system because of the water ingestion. Ayahuasca is also a sacrament that can involve a lot of purging. You know, to prepare for these retreats, you know, you may get advice like, don't have any salt in your diet for a number of days ahead of time. So you may just be low on electrolytes when you get there. And, you know, tobacco, you know, is a master healing type of plant. It's often used, you know, through inhalation and smoking. But when it comes to things like rectal tobacco enemas or, you know, oral ingestion of tobacco juices, it can get extremely intense as far as the purgative effects there. And there may be some interaction potential between, you know, like really high amounts of nicotine stimulation and ayahuasca. So I just caution people to sort of like, listen to your body when you go to these things, you know, kind of think about like, geez, like, have I been not eating any salt and barfing for days on end now? Like, gee, like that you could be getting into some hot water depending on who you are and what your physiology is. So not necessarily straight up contraindications, but I really caution people with combinations of purgatives and kind of thinking about taking care of their body as they go.
What about the vast array of nootropics that have been released into the world? Adderall, modafinil, armodafinil, and then there's like these other ones that some of the digital nomad folks are really into. What do you think about the smart drugs and ayahuasca?
Well, if you're thinking about like for example, one of them that you said was Adderall, right? So like Adderall is an amphetamine salt, and I would think that like amphetamines and ayahuasca are just not really a great combination. You know, when it comes to weaker stimulants, things like methylphenidate or Ritalin, you know, things like modafinil, you know, I'll say in stoplight terms, maybe it's a yellow, like we're not in the red zone anymore, but it's kind of like, again, like what's your intention, right? To be really smart and hack the ayahuasca experience, or is it okay to take a break from those supplements for a few days because, you know, you're trying to get out of that cognitive type of space and into a more nonlinear and spiritual type of space, right? And so, like, I guess I don't have all the answers. Like the racetams, for example, like aniracetam. You know, anecdotally, I've heard those things can potentiate psychedelic types of experiences, but there's no data that would really like allow me to confidently say they do. And then when it comes to risks, I think it's it's kind of a black box. So when it comes to things, right, like nootropics, you know, I don't know a ton about like herbal Chinese supplements, like, but they often have like tons of ingredients in them, and they can have things that release neurotransmitters or block the reuptake of neurotransmitters. So again, it's kind of like, well, you know, what are the risks of stopping my nootropics for a few days to have this experience? Or what are the risks of, you know, taking a week off of the Chinese herbs before I do my ayahuasca experience? And if you cannot point to like a really horrible type of withdrawal syndrome or like a real, you know, big crash in your quality of life or something, it just seems like why would it be a risk that you want to take when there's just zero supporting the safety as far as like real information out there?
So what are some of the commonly consumed drugs that are most likely to be safe or don't have a strong interaction?
Yeah, this is so, yeah, the good, right? And so
The caffeine. Can I drink caffeine and drink ayahuasca?
like caffeine and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, I'll say that's another one that's in the yellow zone, and it
Oh,
probably really
God.
depends on the amount of caffeine, right? So if you drink a cup of green tea with like 25, 50 milligrams of caffeine in the morning time, 8 a.m., by 8 p.m. that night, there's really pretty small amounts there. And like, are you putting yourself in physiological harm's way with that type of thing? No, not really. You know, you're driving to ceremony, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're pretty tired. Let me just stop and get a venti triple espresso. Okay, well, first of all, that might be against the rules and kind of disrespectful to your experience overall. But yeah, those things have like 300 plus milligrams of caffeine in it. So yeah, you might be running the risk of getting a really high blood pressure or something like that. You know, when I think when it comes to like good, like I get a lot, like for example, like I've got this ceremony coming up, you know, my moon cycle just hit, I'm in horrible cramps, like can I take an ibuprofen? It's like, yes, like you can take ibuprofen. You can take a drug like a Tylenol, like so like just like a for example, maybe you stopped coffee for a week ahead of time and now you're showing up to ayahuasca ceremony, you've got a splitting caffeine withdrawal headache. Right? Like it would be okay to take an ibuprofen or a Tylenol for that, and you're not putting yourself in harm's way with that type of thing. You know, there's like you.
What about aspirin? Aspirin, yeah. Acetaminophen,
yeah,
ibuprofen, all of those, you know, green light.
I say so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will confess, like I bring green tea to the ayahuasca ceremony because like around 3 a.m, I'm just like, oh my God, I need a little bit of, you know, green tea. We don't really want the hape.
Yeah.
And then in, in Brazil, I remember I was like in the Brazilian Santo Daime community of Mapia, and literally like they have these really long church works, you know, hours and hours, like 16 hours, 12 hours. And then like there's this one time where like in the middle of the work, they rang the bell for like the break and everyone went home to eat a whole bunch of food, which included fried meat and beans and rice, and like washed down with really strong cups of coffee. And then after they were done eating, then the bell rang and everyone went back to the church to drink more ayahuasca. So I found that fascinating too, like the amount of coffee drinking in Brazil and daime drinking, kind of like simultaneous, you know, within the same thing. But yeah, it can feel weird. It can feel like your heart is like, you know, yeah. So maybe caution is advised.
Yeah. So
What else?
So I guess we talked about serotonin toxicity, right? And this is more about monoamine oxidase A and serotonin, either increasing the amount of it somehow. The other type of problem that you can get with monoamine oxidase inhibitors is called like a hypertensive crisis. And it's essentially your blood pressure is so high that you're at risk for something like a stroke. And this is classically thought of as more like a diet type of interaction, in that there's certain fermented and aged foods that contain an amino acid tyramine that is broken down by monoamine oxidase. And when you have monoamine oxidase inhibitor, it becomes like a real blood pressure increasing type of thing. I will say with ayahuasca, the risks of these hypertensive crises is probably much, much lower. than the irreversible monoamine oxidase inhibitors, because tyramine is broken down by monoamine oxidase A and B. Whereas ayahuasca only inhibits monoamine oxidase A. So you still have monoamine oxidase B that's metabolically available to metabolize tyramine. So as far as that, like tyramine still has a metabolic out. Tyramine still has a metabolic backdoor with the monoamine oxidase inhibitors with ayahuasca, where it really doesn't with those first type of pharmaceutical ones. So when I think of like dietary risks, I think of them much more strongly associated with those initial irreversible inhibitors of monoamine oxidase A and B rather than ayahuasca.
Got it. So if you
Yeah.
were on a contraindicated medication and you wanted to go to ayahuasca ceremony, what do you do?
Yeah, so it probably depends on the medication you're taking, but you know, if you're really like, okay, like how do I avoid a harmful physiological type of interaction risk? It's essentially you would want to stop the drug that's predicted to interact at what we call in pharmacy or pharmacology at least 5 half-lives of the drug before ingesting ayahuasca. So as an example, let's just say you're on drug X and you go to the internet and type half-life of drug X, and it comes up that the half-life of drug X is 24 hours. That means that 5 times 24 hours or 5 days is the amount of time that you would need to eliminate almost all of that drug from your body system. So like a half-life is the time it takes to get rid of half of the drug. Right? So after 24, let's say you start with 100 milligrams of the drug in your system. After that 24 hours, there's going to be 50 milligrams left. After another 24 hours, there's going to be half of 25 milligrams left, right? So by 5 half-lives, it's predicted that you have about 3% of the original amount of drug left in your system. And for all intents and purposes in pharmacology, that's more or less assumed to be gone. And there's not really a risk of a significant interaction at that point. So it depends on the drug, but the sort of basic rule of thumb that you could apply to almost any drug is to wait 5 half-lives.
That's a really good tip. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. There could be some caveats, right? For example, some drugs get metabolized into something else that's also a drug that's active, right? So it could be like, well, like Prozac, fluoxetine or Prozac gets metabolized to norfluoxetine, which is also an SSRI. So when thinking about 5 half-lives of Prozac or fluoxetine, I'm thinking not only of the half-life of fluoxetine, but the half-life of norfluoxetine. So there's a little bit of caveat to it, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb in general.
Got it. Okay, so last question. Microdosing. Microdosing has become the rage, as you might have noticed.
Yeah.
This past year where everyone's just kind of like, I need something to deal with anxiety. What can I do? So I know that microdosing ayahuasca, vine, just the pure vine cappy, has become more of a practice in the global north. And you know, in my perspective, look, you know, if you're taking a microdose and that microdose is technically 1/10 of like a full adult serving, you know, we're dealing with really small amounts. So if a person was on a contraindicated medication, could they safely microdose ayahuasca?
I mean, I can't answer that question and say that like they can safely do it. You know, I can, you know, kind of riff on the theme here is that we're talking about serotonin toxicity as a type of poisoning. It would depend on the dosing and the amount, right? Those serotonin reuptake inhibitors are pretty potent at blocking serotonin reuptake, even at fairly low types of doses. Like sometimes I hear people say, like, I'm on a low dose, so it must not be like blocking serotonin reuptake as much. It's kind of like, like there's still a pretty good chance that it does. And then when I look at like the, you know, like I guess you could cook your own, but there's, you know, several types of supplements that I've seen out there that are, you know, for microdosing ayahuasca, and like I rarely see them, or they don't necessarily have like quantifiable types of ingredients on the back of it. So it seems like they're taking a small dose, but I really have no clue how concentrated that microdosing supplement is. And I don't really know where they're at as far as their other drug or medication. And so at this point in time, I think if you want to microdose something while you're taking an antidepressant, well, there's no data about any of them, but I do know that something like psilocybin is not going to put you at risk of something like a serotonin toxicity. Logically, you're using very, very tiny amounts of something. It's hard to say, well, that's the same risk as like a full ceremony type of dose, but it's essentially, again, I kind of think of it as like we're playing with fire a little bit, and that you're mixing two drugs together that we're pretty confident has some risk at some point, and we don't know where the point is that it becomes risky. So for me, in this interview, with all of the people watching, I think it's really hard for me to say that that's a safe thing to do. I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing is, there are no studies. There's no studies about any of this. So, a lot of it is there's no data. So, yeah, a lot of it's going to depend on your risk tolerance. And if you are advocating for safety, if you're advocating for, harm reduction, then you would also recommend that people take the appropriate precautions and not take that risk with their own well-being and health. So yeah,
I mean, if you weren't taking contraindicated medications, right? Like, okay, I mean, pure vine, well, that's not even a psychedelic, right? So it's legal. So that's like a pretty cool thing about vine microdosing. If you're not on contraindicated drugs, is that you're not breaking the law if you're in a jurisdiction where psychedelics are illegal. And then it's a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So, if you've tapered off your contraindicated medication and waited an appropriate amount of time and you're still experiencing symptoms of depression, then, logically it would be a pretty effective type of antidepressant compound. And, traditional microdosing with like psilocybin or LSD, there's a few different regimens out there, but the most common one is to use it every third day because you tend to develop a lot of acute tolerance with things like psilocybin or LSD, where if you take it day after day, they really do lose their effect pretty quickly. But what we do know about ayahuasca and the psychedelic NN DMT that it contains is that it doesn't really have that tolerance, is that you can administer DMT. Rick Strassman did it intravenously every 30 minutes, 4 times in a row, and people had really potent experiences every time. And you kind of think about ayahuasca drinking, it's pretty common that you drink several nights in a row. And it's also pretty common that someone may offer you multiple drinks throughout the night, where that would be pretty strange to have a psilocybin ceremony every night for 2 or 3 days in a row. And it's also like relatively strange, I think, to offer boosters of psilocybin because you develop a tolerance so quickly that the chances of the booster really elevating the experience too much more is less. So ayahuasca itself is nice in that it doesn't have a tolerance to it like other psychedelics. And then the vine component itself is like, well, just logically, rationally, it should be a pretty potent antidepressant. And it should be safe as long as you're avoiding contraindicated foods or drugs.
Yeah, I think the big issue for most people that want to microdose is the availability, right? So, even if psilocybin is safer to microdose with, a lot of people don't have the ability to get it. I mean, maybe maybe you have connections and can connect with a local underground mushroom dealer, but then how do you get it into capsules? Getting into capsules is the next challenge you have to overcome. So then maybe you grind it yourself and then like put it into pills yourself and then weigh it out, and then it becomes really laborious. Like that's an obstacle. Yeah, and so I think it's just the accessibility for people that allows them to look towards the product that is being sold online legally in most countries. on a Shopify store, you know, like shipping to all 50 states, right? So I think that's the tricky thing about the, you know, wanting to do the ayahuasca microdosing, you know, by buying a product off the internet that's an extract, and then having to weigh, like, you know, whether or not like you should do it or could safely do it if you're on antidepressants. So, you know, I do sincerely hope that we move more quickly towards the day where we can actually get the psilocybin microdoses and order it online, or like get a, you know, prescription, or, you know, something like a Hello MD, you know, kind of like online medical license thing, and then go to your
Yeah.
dispensary and get your supply. But yeah, I think, you know, right, we're still in that wild west of the psychedelic renaissance. So, you know, it's a lot is about safety, harm reduction, you know, weighing your risks, and being informed.
Yeah,
So
there's certainly a ton to know when it comes to picking circles, and I'm sure you've got some other great guests to speak more about that. But yeah,
yeah,
like
yeah,
beyond
lots of
avoiding
different
all the
opinions.
drugs, I mean, like finding the right opportunity in the center and the people that you trust, and it is the Wild West.
So we're at the end of our time together, and you have a gift for the audience. I'd love to hear about what your free gift is.
Yeah, so you know, in this talk, we've talked a little bit about contraindicated medications. You know, we talked a little bit about combinations or drugs that might be safe with ayahuasca. Whereas the free gift is it's a lecture, and essentially it goes into detail. You know, lists of medications that are contraindicated with ayahuasca. You know, lists of medications that you know, are either safe to combine, or you may need to combine them in the case of like an emergency circumstance. For example, like sometimes I hear like, oh, asthma inhalers and ayahuasca are a dangerous combination. It's kind of like, well, there might be some risk to that combination, but the reality is if you're having a severe asthma attack, there's risks to that too, right? So kind of thinking a little bit more about like, what drugs could I use in a serious type of emergency, right? And then kind of talking a little bit more about spirituality, and okay, like Mr. Pharmacist, you have this drug over here on the safe list, but you know, I have an issue with this drug. You know, I have a relationship that needs healing with that drug. So should I combine those two things? Yeah, probably not, right? So the free gift is an expansion of our discussion here today that has a lot of like visual aids and kind of like slide supports that kind of really mechanistically walks you through what monoamine oxidase inhibitors are, you know, how they work, the differences between reversible and irreversible types, and then right, drugs that you can combine, drugs that you can't combine, and then, you know, drugs that are up to you and your relationship with them as far as what you're going to do.
Wonderful. I'll put the link to the free gift down below. And I also want to hear about your course, because you released a really valuable course that I think folks that are interested in tapering off of antidepressants might find useful. Can you share a little bit more about that program?
Yeah. So when you look at the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, and we're talking psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, the serotonergic types of psychedelics, you know, all of the research that's been done is essentially depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. And all of these psychiatric illnesses, the first line, or the types of medications that like the American Psychiatric or American Psychological Association would recommend to treat those, are SSRI or SNRI types of antidepressants. And with ayahuasca, we've talked about in this interview that there may be actual risks of physical harm combining antidepressants with ayahuasca, whereas psilocybin, LSD, other serotonergic psychedelics, MDMA, the antidepressants may just interfere with them and water down the experience, and you may not get the sort of big psychedelic experience or insight or emotional breakthroughs that you're hoping for. So there are so many people that are interested in using psychedelics for therapeutic purposes that are currently taking those serotonin blocking reuptake antidepressants. And unfortunately, there's very little good information out there about how to safely taper off of them, the length of periods that you may want to wait between tapering and trying psychedelics. Over 50% of these SSRI or SNRI antidepressants are prescribed through primary care, so they're not prescribed through psychiatry or specialists that are used to increasing and decreasing and switching doses. And so the number of long-term antidepressant users is increasing. And essentially the data demonstrates that providers themselves don't really have the information or confidence sometimes to successfully help people taper and wean them. And I just saw so much as far as different answers, opinions, some of it kind of reasonable and some of it just really off base about what people should do when they're thinking about using psychedelic therapies and they're coming from a world of traditional antidepressants. So I wanted to make this course resource so that they can have all the information they need to make really good, informed, empowered choices about what's safe for them and what the next step on their healing journey is. So the course, Antidepressant Tapering in Preparation for Psychedelic Therapies, is actually, I would say, 75% a course about tapering antidepressants and about 25% about the actual drug interactions with psychedelics and approaching that. But it's mostly, can you understand, how to get the most out of your antidepressant and what a good course of antidepressant therapy looks like. The kind of factors that you would want to weigh if you're considering to stop or discontinue your antidepressant, what antidepressant withdrawal reactions look like and how to differentiate those withdrawal reactions from return of the symptoms of your original illness, like depression or anxiety. Strategies for tapering antidepressants and monitoring that taper. And specifically, I include not only like a lecture about it, but a monitoring tapering packet, because my philosophy is essentially there's so much variability in what people feel when they stop antidepressants that maybe we should just take a reasonable first step, track some data, and see what it looks like, and then you'll be able to plan the subsequent steps and have some really good information that is based upon yourself for continuing the taper, because different people just need different rates of taper. They're coming from different places, different doses, different histories with the antidepressants. And then, kind of finally talking about that interface between psychedelics and antidepressants, how the two types of drugs may work differently, and sort of how you may make a transition from a world of traditional antidepressants over to psychedelic therapies.
So one of the issues that come up for folks when they're trying to taper off their antidepressants is they kind of they cut their amount down, and then the last stretch can be really difficult. And I've spoken to a number of people that I know who have tried this, and it just ended up being so emotional. I mean, some of the emotional imbalances and grief and that was coming up for them move them towards suicidal ideation. And so do you address what to do in those cases? Is the answer just to get back on, or get over the hump? Is there a risk?
It's true, right, that the closer that you get to the end of the taper, typically the harder it gets. And the hardest step for a lot of people is going from some drug, no matter how small it is, to no drug at all. I think the course is literally I'm designing the course to try to prevent that situation where they get to the sort of crash course where there actually is suicidality. In the taper and monitoring packet, right, essentially the person is able to plot their feelings day to day and kind of see if mood, anxiety, or sleep are declining, and or withdrawal symptoms are severe. And I think when it comes to sort of something as severe as suicidality, that to me would be kind of a line in the sand as far as well, geez, if there's actual risk of hurting yourself because of the way that this taper is going, that probably would be an indication that the person needs to pop the dose back up for a while and restabilize themselves. But the idea of the course is for the person to be able to get the information and then design a taper that is slow enough that they're really only experiencing a mild, possibly moderate type of withdrawal reaction at any given time. And the goal is really to prevent them from getting to the place where the withdrawal is severe. And when people start antidepressants, we always tell people, well, you're going to have to take this for 4 to 6 weeks to see if the drug has like a good effect for you. And what this means is that the drug works over a long period of time to create some type of change in your brain, because it blocks the serotonin reuptake pump on day one. But why is it 4 to 6 weeks later that people feel a little better or turn a corner? Well, it's a neuroadaptation event. So when you're stopping antidepressants, I kind of think the same thing. It's like, well, geez, if it took 4 to 6 weeks to have the neuroadaptation event occur, it's probably going to take 4 to 6 weeks for it to reverse. So sometimes people get these tapers where it's kind of like, all right, I'm just going to taper down 25% every single week. Week 1 goes by pretty good. Okay, week 2 goes by pretty good. And then week 3, things get really awful all of a sudden. And it's probably because you're stacking the withdrawal reactions upon yourself. You're only waiting a week to decrease doses, but each dose decrease probably takes you 4 to 6 weeks to really reach your new baseline again. So essentially, that's one more reason why I think people have a lot of difficulty the closer they get to the end, is because maybe some of the withdrawal effects from previous dose decreases are actually accumulating as they go as well.
Got it. Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing your vast wealth of knowledge. We'll put the link to the online course down below this video, as well as the discount code that the audience can receive by stepping through to your program through your link below. Thank you so much for your time and sharing so generously with all the information and research that you've done in this space. I want to wish you a beautiful rest of your day, and take care. Stay safe out there.
Thank you so much, Lauren.